Okay, we're good to go.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a few minutes to get joined up. So for those of you who are just joining, we're going to wait a couple more minutes and let people get joined up to the seminar before we get started. So actually, I think I'll start at 5 after. So if any of you need a really quick break between your previous meeting and this one, you have 2 minutes this way. So I want to thank everybody for joining our webinar. This webinar is going to talk about the AmeriFlux DOI methodology and data policy. And I'm Deb Agarwal. I lead the AMP data team. And Yue, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Yue Jia. I'm also part of the data team.
Thank you. Next slide. So, as part of the introduction, I just want to talk a little bit about the topics we'll go over today in the webinar and give you a little bit of feel for this. And we want it to be very interactive. So, if you have questions along the way, I think initially I would suggest putting them in the chat and we'll answer them in real time. But then we'll also stop and give, and people are welcome to just ask questions as well. I think everybody has an ability to unmute themselves, though maybe not, since I couldn't when I first came in. So maybe use the chat. So the objectives of the webinar. First off, we want to explain how the digital object identifiers that we use on the data for the citations, how those work, what they are, how we assign them, and provide some of the information about how you can help us to have those the metadata with those digital object identifiers be accurate. Then we're going to talk about some upcoming changes in the data usage policy in AmeriFlux. We're adding a new open tier, and I think you'll find that quite exciting. And I also want to talk about citations and some of the things that are changing in the citation space, because there have been some emerging problems that I think we can start to address by starting to look at how we can change the citations. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Wei, first to talk about the digital object identifiers. All yours, you, Wei.
All right, thank you, Deb. So I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of what digital object identifiers are. They are a unique alphanumeric string that's assigned by a registration agency. Typically two parts to it. There's a prefix that begins with a 10 dot and then an ID followed by a slash and then a suffix. What comes after the 10 dot is usually an ID that maps to an agency, which is typically the publisher, and then what's in the suffix is ID that maps to a certain set of data. And a DOI ties together metadata of an object with a location. So it bundles together three parts: name, metadata, and a URL. And DOIs are resolvable. So if you put in a DOI into like the doi.org URL, it's going to forward it to a valid location, or return can be found if it's not available. And the difference between DOIs and paper citations are that if you want to cite the data, you should use the DOIs, whereas a paper citation references just the characteristics of that paper. And DOIs are meant to be compliant with the FAIR principles. So it's supposed to be findable. I don't really recall what the FAIR all stands for, but reproducible, and it's reusable and allows for
Accessible, interoperable, and reusable.
Thank you. So in the context of AmeriFlux, we issue DOIs because if you're a site team, you want to get credit for those data that you put out and you work so hard with. And currently, we only assign DOIs to sites with published data products. And the only DOI that we put out right now applies to the base BADM data product. And we issue DOIs by assigning them through the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, known as OSTI, which is a DOE entity that's responsible for issuing these DOIs. The current format that we have for these DOIs has the format 10.17190/AMF, and then some generic ID, which is issued by OSTI. We typically release the DOIs after the first data release, within a month of that release. And if you were to do any updates to the metadata of the DOI, we would update it on the AmeriFlux website, but we only sync with OSTI the changes that happens about 3 to 4 times a year at this point, although we plan to make more frequent updates in the near future. The metadata for the DOIs are populated using information from the BEDM metadata, and I'll go into that in more detail in the next slide. So if you have been part of the process of putting out data from your site, you are now familiar with the hard work that's involved getting the data in on the top, which is you go through the FP in data formats, go through all the QA/QC processes, and then at the end, out comes a product which we tag with a version bundled with the rest of the metadata and zip it up, make it available on the AmeriFlux website. There are two groups that we use to populate the DOI metadata information. And if the site hasn't previously have any DOIs that were assigned, we would use the information from the team member information in the site journal info to populate the DOI groups, the contributor groups, and the organization groups. And alongside that, we derive the location where the site is and the description, and use all of this to bundle it up, send it to OST to generate a DOI, which we then use to which you can then use to cite the data. Any subsequent updates for contributors and organizations are done directly through the BEDM DOI group, which there's an editor for it, and I'll go into it in more detail later. The DOI related data DOI group is meant to be for you to cite or link together other relevant data DOIs so that people, when they come across your DOIs, they can look into other relevant data sets as well. So there are two main DOI pages if you're a site team that you should be aware of. If you go to your site page and you're a registered AmeriFlux site, there's a DOI tab, and then there's some descriptions about which to use for citations. And then there's a link here, which is a resolvable URL. When you click on this link, it actually goes to the doi.org domain, and then it resolves and lands on this page here, which is the DOI landing page. On this page, you find descriptions of the data set, the creators involved, and other bits of metadata and citations related to the data set. And if you're a site team, you may be interested to find out how you can update that metadata. Or in that tab, on the site info tab, there's a BEDM tab, and then there's a place where you can access the online editor, which has the name called DOI authorship. So as an example, this is an online DOI editor page when you first load and has no information. Typically, we would seed information from the BEDM groups automatically once the data is published, so that this page is generally populated. However, if it's a brand new site and there's no data release yet, this is what you will come across. So for the DOI organization group, there are two fields to it. There's the organization field, which would typically be, say, the institution that you belong to, and then you would choose like originator. And if it's the sponsor of your project, you would select the sponsor. The contributor group has more fields to it. You put in a name for the contributor that's involved. And there are currently only two rows that describe the contributor. One is an author, and the other is just other at this point. The ordinal is used to sort the contributors. And if you leave it blank, we just sort it by alphabetical order, and oftentimes that's not the case. So remember to populate this so that you order the contributors as is appropriate. ORCID ID, if you have ORCID IDs, you should list it, emails, the institutions that the contributors belong to, and then the start and end dates of when the personnel is part of the DOI. And lastly, the DOI related data DOI is for linking different data DOIs that are related to, in this case, AmeriFlux data set. I would point out that if there are other parts of data sets like Fluxnet, which M generates, please do not put this in this field because we do the linking automatically. So as an example, this is data DOI from the Mayberry wetland site. And as you can see, this has a lot of contributors. It's sorted by different ordinals. You have the ORCID IDs and all of that. And if you go to, this is on the landing page. It's all sorted based on what is populated in the metadata. Similarly, the description here is populated from the BEDM site general info description. And then the citation string we just generated based on the metadata that we have. And this is somewhat, we will be revising this as time progresses, and that we will go into more detail about this later. If you're a data user and you're trying to cite a lot of DOIs, you know it's fairly challenging because it can be a lot of sites to manage. We have this tool called Site Sets, which allows you to build a collection of sites. And once you add them as part of a site set, there's the option to generate multiple DOIs in a format, which is at this point, it's a tab separated value format. And you can open it in Excel, import it, and you would be able to access all of the DOIs that are relevant to those data sets right away. So I briefly mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, but there are other Flux data products that are part of the ecosystem, and we handle the DOIs for all of these products through OSTI. So there's the base BADM AmeriFlux DOI, which we currently generate for AmeriFlux and is on the AmeriFlux website, which has the following format, 17190/AMF and an ID. The Fluxnet 2015 and the Fluxnet methane datasets we're also responsible for generating the DOIs for those. Those have a slightly different format. It's 10.18140 FLX and an ID. And the contributors and the organizations for these products for AmeriFlux sites are seeded and shared unless the person who is responsible for working with those data sets collect those from the sites. So the basic rule is that any contributor and organization information are shared across the sites. We do provide the option to allow a specific set of contributors to specific data sets if you need to. Please contact us if that's the case. Organizations, I'll just reemphasize, is shared across data products. There's no available option to specify ones that are differently for different data sets. And different data products in this ecosystem, the Fluxnet and AmeriFlux ecosystems are linked automatically. So with that, I think that's all I have, and I'll pass the ball back to Deb. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yue. So I'd like to share my screen. So if you could, yeah, there you go. Get back in there. Okay, so first off, what I wanted to do is just share the online version of our current data usage policy, because I want to talk a little bit about the data usage policy and some opportunities that we have to modernize that to fit better with current use. And so the primary portion of the usage policy is really here under this heading. And so first off is about the download, and you're actually, so when people download the data, there will be a notification that goes to the data contributor, and they know then about that download and who downloaded it. The user is also requested when they start in-depth analysis that will result in a publication to contact the data contributors directly so that they have the opportunity to contribute. So that is the current policy. Then then acknowledgement is required. here. And then and they're also supposed to inform all data providers when publications are about to be published and acknowledge the data source. Okay, so that is the current policy as it exists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some changes we'd like to make. So let me stop that share and go back to the slide deck. Okay. So as part of that modernization, I think there's a couple of different things that are going on. First off, there's some challenges with that requirement to contact the PI. There's a lot of users starting to emerge that would like to do a bulk download of a large percentage of the AmeriFlux data and then utilize it in analyses. And we now have 350 sites with data, and that's growing at a very rapid pace. And so you can well imagine that anything over 50, in fact, when I first joined working with folks, 30 was considered too many to have to contact. At 350, contacting each of the individual authors and or contributors and tracking the opportunities to contribute, etc., is starting to maybe not be as feasible anymore. And keep in mind, the contact is already going to occur on the download anyway, so the different sites will know who has downloaded their data already. And that later contact is what we think is a little bit high a burden, except for when somebody's used a small number of sites. Another challenge that's been occurring with this policy is that AmeriFlux has been around in different versions, and the data has certainly been around for well over 25 years at this point. And so, what's happening is people are retiring. People are no longer available via the internet, at least not the ones that we have available on this world. And following that policy is starting to be very difficult. And it's unclear then whether or not you can use that data because the policy says you should directly contact that data contributor. So this is one of the things we'd like to address. And so we have a method that we're looking at. We're proposing to do that, and you'll see that. Another problem with the current usage policy is a modern data usage policy has a large number more explanations of the rights that the user has, in particular things like redistribution rights. And why redistribution rights are important is the fact that there are many tools starting to emerge that want to be able to serve up some version of the AmeriFlux data in the context of other tools, other data, other capabilities. So some examples of that, the pecan modeling and uncertainty tool, there's an R tool that got developed that could do nice analyses and plotting. There are other tools starting to emerge. Without explicit redistribution rights, those tools are actually also kind of in limbo, and it's unclear how well they're following the policy when in fact they redistribute that data but since the policy doesn't explicitly say what they can do. Another thing that we recently dealt with in another project is, at some point the AMP project probably moves to some other lab or somewhere else, or this data moves to a data repository. Without those redistribution rights, there is no actual right to move that data to somewhere else. There's also no adaptation rights. So that means trying to start to build products, integrated products out of this. There's no clear, explicit rights that allow that. which for many means that they'll interpret it as that it's not allowed. And it leaves it up to the user to interpret, which I don't think we want to do. So let me move on. I want to talk about a policy that's become very common in usage, and I just want to give you a feel for what that is. So Creative Commons is an international group that have come together to try and develop a set of usage and licensing terms that can be used broadly and that can, in particular, a lot of their goal is to provide open and free and fair use type of policies. They do have ones with restrictions as well. The one I'm most interested in is the Creative Commons by attribution, which is commonly known as CC by 4. And there, the data is free to be shared, redistributed, and adapted, but there's a requirement to actually attribute, provide attribution for the data. And that appropriate credit is defined by the repository that's providing the data. So in that case, it'd be us, AmeriFlux. So we define what it means to give appropriate credit, but data would explicitly be allowed to be shared and adapted. So the Flexnet 2015 data paper is a great example of where we have done this, right? So the Flexnet 2015 data paper, when that came out, the publisher explicitly required that it be an open policy, which AmeriFlux policy was not considered open because of the requirement to contact authors. So in that case, most of the sites moved to this CC by 4, which then allowed that data paper to exist and become the citation for those sites. So just to give you a feel for sort of how broadly this has been adopted, and I'm going to kind of use the CC by 4 liberally because I'm also talking about sites where for the usage aspects of the data, the policy that is provided is almost identical to CC by 4. In that case, I call it custom, but similar to CC by 4. But you can see here in this list that not only the Flexnet 2015 data paper has used this, but also ESS Dive, which is now the Department of Energy Environmental System Science data repository, offers CC by 4 and CC0, which is completely public domain. Neon has a policy that's very similar to CC by 4. The ICOS Carbon Portal uses a policy similar to CC by 4. The atmospheric research, no, radiation measurement. I think that's right. Margaret can correct me.
Atmospheric radiation measurement program, ARM.
There we go. They use a policy very similar to CC by 4. The Earth System Grid Federation uses a policy similar to CC by 4 for the CMIP datasets. They have different policies for different datasets, but CMIP is their big one. That's that climate measurement program that's connected with the UN results. Figshare offers Creative Commons licenses. LTER, it's specified by data products, so that one really doesn't. I can't claim that as CC by 4 at all. The Arctic Data Center is CC by 4, and NASA tends to release their data public domain, so CC0. So that gives you a feel. It's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a feel for many of the comparable data sets to AmeriFlux that, in fact, a large number of them have moved to CC by 4 or something very similar. So some of the advantages that we get from that are compatibility with these other data sets. It would allow those value-added tools to be able to have those redistribution and other aspects to them. It also is going to allow that AmeriFlux data can more easily be used in papers and data papers, because a lot of the publishers are now starting to ask that the data be archived somewhere where it has an open data policy. And for many of those publishers, they will not accept the AmeriFlux policy as being an open data policy. Even though users can get the data, they consider an open data policy to be that you're able to get the data and use it without restrictions. And that author contact is a restriction. So moving on, what our current plan is by the end, sorry, the videos are in front of, so by the end of 2021 calendar, what we plan to do is actually institute a new AmeriFlux usage policy that is CC by 4 or similar. That's still to be worked out, but let's start with an assumption it's CC by 4. So that makes the data free for use and reuse. Proper citation and acknowledgement would still be required where the specifics are specified, and sites would still receive that data download notification. Now, along with that, we would support sites that remain on the older AmeriFlux policy. So but we want to incentivize that people move to this more open policy. And so in fact, the services at that AmeriFlux policy are going to be a little bit more limited. So, one example that I think is pretty important is the one-flux processing. We're going to offer that at the CC by 4, but not necessarily at the AmeriFlux policy level. I think that, some of the, you still get the data quality checks and base publish, but not at the same priority as folks who've moved to the CC by 4. Some things like that. That gives you some examples of sort of how we're thinking about this. So we would still support the AmeriFlux policy and sites that choose to stay there. We already have sites where there is no one responsible for that data willing to respond and allow a policy to be more open. So some sites, almost by definition, are probably going to end up staying in the AmeriFlux policy, but we would want to encourage most sites to move. So some other key aspects, we're going to have one data policy per site. And just to let you know, at this point, the AmeriFlux core sites, which is on the order of 40 sites, and the Neon sites, which are on the order of 40 sites, have already agreed that that their data, that they would be able to go CC by 4 or something similar. In fact, for Neon, this is actually valuable because their policy is already much more open. And so it was actually a challenge for them to be suddenly putting it under an AmeriFlux policy that required this additional contact. So we also want to look at the citation policy and modernize that. So Wei talked a lot about the citation. There are some things that we've had as standard policy in the past that with all my work on data citation and data repositories, I've come to realize we really need to modernize. So one of those is when a user utilizes the data to get a result, the data that they use has to be cited, and it has to be cited as a reference. And if they also needed, use the papers that describe the site in order to help with site characterization, they must also cite those papers. But what we want to move away from is having that the user, if they only use the data and never read a paper, are not citing that paper that they never read. Instead, they're citing the data because that makes it fair, right? The FAIR acronym was findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You lose pretty much all of those when I read the paper, I can't find the citation for the data. If I'm finding a paper about the data, it doesn't help me to get to the data. So this is, I think, really important. Another challenge we've been having is that there isn't recognition in the current system of other data contributors. I know it sounds a little self-serving, but the AmeriFlux data team and tech team currently get no credit in all of that. And we have a lot of young up and coming researchers working on those teams. And if we want them to keep being able to work on those teams, we're going to have ways that they're getting credit for all this work on the QA/QC, on all these different services that you receive as part of that AmeriFlux system. It's also, so another challenge we're having is it's very difficult to cite a large number of sites in the reference section of a paper. So if someone's used any approximation of the 350 sites worth of data that we have, putting 350 references in or citations in your reference section doesn't tend to be an option because of the sheer number of pages required, which has tended to mean that it's starting to show up in the supplementary material. This has been particularly the worst or the hardest when it's a high profile paper, because they tend to also have page limits, which means it's even more likely that the references all end up in the supplementary material. I realize those supplementary materials are starting to become indexed and available as something where you actually could find that citation, but I think it'll be quite a while before that's really there. And I think regardless, if we don't provide means for those changes, as we grow, I mean, when it's 400 or 500 references at some point, it's going to be hard really to cite every individual site. So I want to talk about how we might approach that. So for the DOI citation information, we're making a few changes to that. So updates to those. So here is a standard AmeriFlux citation now, just as a reminder. A couple of things we're going to do. So first off, as part of FAIR, there's a real emphasis on being able to find the right version of the data. And so we're going to be adding to the citation the version number. So, like an example would be version 17-5 to this, to the citation. That would go right after the dataset title before it says dataset. So right in here. Okay. Also, as you pointed out, we're going to have lots more products coming out, and we already have multiple products. So right now we use AmeriFlux to be the proxy for describing what product we're referring to, but that's no longer going to be useful once we have other products that we're building. So the proposal right now is, and this one's not settled, but it's I think we're close, would be to change this AmeriFlux field to say base-BATM and add AmeriFlux or AmeriFlux Management Project. Again, that's not yet settled, as the publisher, because at the moment we don't list a publisher here in the citation. And in fact, that again has become common practice to list who is the publisher. Back when we started all this in 2013, that guidance, there was enough conflict among the guidance that we said we're not even going to set the publisher, we're not going to set the version. Now these things are much more settled, so we're adding those in. Okay, so I promised I'd talk a little bit about collective citations. I want to finish reasonably quickly, so I'm going to go a little bit fast through this. So the reason why we care about those collective citations is that fact that 350 references, citations starts to get out of hand. So I want to look at ways that we can provide a collective citation that still gives the individual contributors all the credit that they need, but also makes the data more usable, right? So that's that combination, is looking at how do we make sure everybody gets very clear credit for their data, and that we have that in fact the user gets a citable data set. So that's include so that it, and the idea here would be then to be expecting that citation, that collective citation, to then be included in the reference section, which would increase the likelihood that it is indexed and that we can find those uses. So it helped tracking the citations. It enabled that credit back to the individuals because the collection itself would then be the mechanism by which we can map it back to the credit. So there's three options we can use. There's data papers as a data citation, which was what happened in Flexnet 2015. There's a dynamic data citation, and there's data collections as a data citation. I'm going to talk briefly about each of those, and then talk about it. And no matter which one we use, we could still always request that a table of the site IDs and versions still be in the paper itself, because some of these wouldn't be as exact about what sites were used. And you would still receive the download notifications, no matter what we did. So I'm going to start with data collections. These are an opportunity to basically assign a DOI to a collection of data elements. Now, in our case, that would be a version of the AmeriFlux data for each of the sites. It'd probably also be some methods papers describing the processing methods that were used. And then that collective DOI would refer to a particular configuration of the AmeriFlux data. So a particular set of versions of each of the site's data. If a user then used exactly those versions for the data, that they would be able to cite that collection. The idea would be if they cite an AmeriFlux site that's like newer data or something else, that just like with our old policies in Flexnet, what we'd probably want to do is say, if you're going to cite one site individually, you got to cite all the sites individually. You can no longer use the collection. So that collection would then have a landing page for the DOI that then describes what are all the data sets that are in there, exactly what versions. We would then, as AmeriFlux, be tracking those credits then back to the individual contributors. So one negative with that is it is an imprecise citation, because exactly what sites were used wouldn't show up through the citations themselves. It'd be in that table or other means where we'd address that. So a data paper, and by the way, I mean, if they used all the sites in this data collection, then it would be a precise. It's just most people aren't going to end up using all the sites necessarily. So a data paper, I'm going to assume most of you have a little more familiarity with that. This is writing a paper about the data, but then there is an opportunity to utilize that as the citation. It has sort of the same imprecise citation aspects, because if someone's citing that data paper, you don't, from the citation, know exactly which sites they used. But again, you could use a table of sites in the paper to sort of elucidate that. Again, it could, it's similar to data collections. It'd be fairly easy to trace the data paper usage back to the individual sites so that you'd be able to see what citations your site has. These data papers also provide a lot of visibility because they have all that added work of the paper describing the data. The big challenge there is that it's hard to write a data paper about an evolving data set, because the data set gets ahead of the data paper before the data paper comes out. So it's always quite a bit behind before it gets written. And a lot of the publishers definitely require CC by 4 for those to exist. So I'm almost done. I want to talk about dynamic data citations. Many of you have heard about these. They sound fantastic, right? I mean, we're all like, this is the obvious holy grail. So what are dynamic data citations? Dynamic data citations are where when, now you can choose when you do this, but the repository, that being us, AmeriFlux, can either choose to assign a DOI to the collection of data that a user downloaded every time they download, such that they could then use that DOI as their citation, and that we would have a landing page that has that. Now, I don't suggest that on the downloads, because for the thousands of downloads that we have, it's on the order almost of 1% that we actually see papers from. So I don't want to have to manage 1,000 DOIs per paper, or 100 even. But let's say we set up a mechanism where the user came back and explained, and actually designated what data they'd used, and then we created a DOI for that and a landing page, and then that user used that citation in their paper. Right? Sounds perfect, because it doesn't have that problem of that it cites sites that aren't, that weren't actually part of it. The big challenge is tracking these, because now, you've issued 500,000 DOIs for these dynamic data citations. They're used once, and you have to find all those citations in order to track them back to the individual sites. Right now, the mechanics for doing that are really hard because nobody provides a comprehensive citation index. The different publishers right now are not opening those up. The methods that are supposed to be able to provide this across the systems have been dramatically delayed. They were supposed to be out a year and a half ago. I still haven't even heard a new approximate date of when those might come out. So it's very difficult right now to track those and then provide the attribution back to the individual sites. So I'm gonna, so we don't yet have a clear plan of what we're going to do on these collective citations. I wanted to bring them up so that you can start to think about these 3 different mechanisms, and so that we can, as part of the rest of this webinar time, besides the other topics, we can talk about these as potential ways that we might start to think about providing collective citations. And I wanted to give you enough background that we could have that discussion. So with that, I want to address questions. I see that the chat's been filling up. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'd like to just move to open questions. So are there questions in the chat that haven't been answered that somebody wants to read off and bring forward? And do people have mic capability?
I suggest you could clarify one thing, just because a lot of questions have gone to that.
Okay.
And it's just that a lot of questions that people asking, do we issue a new DOI when data are updated, or does the DOI go all the way back to the first day of data that we have? So I've written that we have one DOI for all data available right now for a given site on AmeriFlux.lbl.gov, which means one DOI for all the base and BATM. But maybe you could even, and soon we'll have a version.
Right.
Maybe you want to clarify
when we add the version.
Can you say what we do have to start, so everyone has the same understanding of what we do offer, and then what we might change? Because I might not have been clear in the chat.
So right now, and I can be blamed for this, the thing that we have is not what is the common recommendation. The common recommendation that you'd hear from a repository is assign a new DOI every time the data changes. So each of you would have about 50 DOIs already at this point, if not more. What we chose at the outset was, in fact, we were just going to assign one DOI to the base BATM data product and not change the DOI with versions, but track all the versions and know by dates and know the download dates, such that any individual who wanted to, that had downloaded that data, we could track back what version did they get. Now, that doesn't help with the FAIR principles. So we can do it internally, but we can't, nobody else can see what that is. Adding the So right now there's no version string in there, but the physical data file people get has a version string in it. By adding the version string to the citation, now when a user reads that paper, they'll be able to see exactly what version was used and then come back and ask for that version if they want to try and do repeatability. And you might ask me, why didn't you just assign a DOI for everyone? The problem from our perspective is sort of the same problem as the collective citations. Then we'd have 50 per site that we'd be tracking in order to find all the citations of that data. And I knew that we had versions already, and I knew we were tracking them internally. And so I made the choice to wait for the version guidance to become clear enough that we could just add versions to the citations. Now you can retroactively go back and you could take all your older versions of your data and just update the citation to have that version string to be accurate for each of the old versions of your data, right? Because AmeriFlux has been assigning those versions pretty much from the beginning of AmeriFlux, which is older than the 2013 takeover of AMP. So that's kind of one of the nice things about that version string is something that's been pretty much the whole period. So yes, you could go back to older versions of your data and clarify exactly what citation it is for those, if you wanted to.
And also, I'll just say that Peter Isaac said he would be willing to tell us what ozflux is doing with their policy, which I thought would be nice to hear.
Sure.
Did you want me to speak to that now, Margaret?
I mean, we could see if there are other questions too. I just wanted to let Deb know.
Okay.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I was thinking you guys were using a policy similar to CC by 4.
I guess we could kick the discussion off now, and let the record show that Margaret actually dropped me in this by posing a question in the chat room. So it's not that I've pushed myself forward; it's that I'm being dragged forward by Margaret.
I said he was willing to speak to it because I asked him. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you very much for putting this on at a time that means we can attend. It's very thoughtful. I've enjoyed it immensely. And there's a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. I also wanted to offer my commiserations to all of my American colleagues on the current state of your country, with both the presidential uncertainty and the raging COVID-19 pandemic. My thoughts
I
are with.
should warn you, Peter. We only have 8 minutes
Okay.
left in the webinar.
My thoughts are with everyone there. Okay, so ozflux uses CC by 4. We used to be on a derivative of CC3 that was share alike by attribution and non-commercial. That was restrictive. So at my colleague Siddharth Guru's behest, and he's on this call too, so I must pay my respects to him, we moved to CC by 4. So we've been on CC by 4 now for I think about 4 or 5 years. In terms of data access, we went, again, at Guru's suggestion, we went with the most open data access that we could achieve. When you download data from the ozflux data portal, you simply have to check a box that says you've read the data use policy and you agree with it. And that just has some general words about contacting researchers, giving them the chance to be co-author on the paper and so on. But it's a simple checkbox that you have to tick before you can download the files from the data portal. There's no enforceability in that. So there's nothing there that we can enforce. The second method of getting ozflux data is from a thread server, because we use netcdf files, so we can just put them on a thread server. Then they're completely open and anybody can get them whenever they want to, without restriction. Now, there's a couple of things in that. Firstly, in terms of data versioning, we don't do explicit data versioning at present. Guru's been suggesting that I do that for some time, and I think we'll move to that. What we do at present is we put the processing date and time into the netcdf file as a global attribute. So you can trace back based on the time that that data was actually processed. The second thing is that because the data are so open, we have no way of knowing who's downloading what. And yeah, there's no requirement to contact the site PI. we don't know who's downloading what data. We can get some information from Google Analytics, but it doesn't resolve down to the individual researcher. It's just an IP number. What we do have, though, is Jamie Cleverly, who is the best thing out of the USA since the 60s. And Jamie religiously goes through the literature and records where our data are being used in papers. And then we make a note of that, and that's fed up to our umbrella organization Turn. Now, it's a thankless task. He does it on a voluntary basis, but it means that we then have a record of where our data are being used by citations or by papers that are being published. And that has been an incredibly powerful thing for us in arguing for the relevance of what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. That was very helpful. And yeah, definitely we have, it is always challenging to find all the citations. We really appreciate that many of you go into the tool and add publications as you find them. So other questions? We have about 4 more minutes. So Gil, you asked whether there's Google tools that allow automating the discovery of which site was cited. I pointed out the power of the fact that we needed the data DOIs by actually trying to look for the data DOI for Harvard. And in Google, you find 3 uses of that data DOI in Google Scholar, in a search. Same with if you look at Crossref and multiple other places. Yeah, almost all the tools. I tried a fair number of them. And that's because we hadn't been giving clear guidance that you should cite the data DOI, but we now are going to do, we've already changed the website to do that more clearly. The problem, the best description of what it takes to track down citations that I've ever found is at the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, and they have a whole description of the 6 sources that they have to go to programmatically, and then the deduplication work that they have to do, plus then a whole lot of manual tracking. They have on the order of 6 people devoted to this effort. So yes, it can be done. Yes, the information is out there. Yes, you either have to get really crafty or you have to pay some fees to publishers, but it can be done. At the moment, we're choosing not to spend the resources to build those tools. So other questions? Questions for you, Wei, about how to use the DOI tool, or have I just swamped everything with, you can barely remember what he said? Because it's really important that you start using the DOI tool to make sure that your authorship is accurate, so that you can get appropriate credit to your team. Because as we move on to the OneFlux processing, which the product name will be called Flexnet, as we start to publish that in the not too distant future, hopefully, that product and those DOIs will also be available, and they'll use the authorship that you've provided us. Yes, Kevin is pointing out the other problem with users right now. They don't have clear understanding of that they're supposed to put the DOI citation in their reference section so that the published paper will then have it indexed as a reference. So that is something else. We'll probably start providing more details on the AmeriFlux website, asking people to not only cite that, but also to cite it in their reference section. That's a good point. But yes, it has been incredibly difficult to get people to cite clearly. So Gil has pointed out we should pop up a clear requirement and explanation that users need to acknowledge before getting data. We do that. So before a user gets to the data download, they have a clear statement of our policy and they do click through that and accept it. Okay, so Kevin is having better luck than I am, but I'm betting it's not through the references section in finding citations. So Kevin, is that citations of papers that used your site?
No, I guess I should speak and identify myself. Yeah, I'm here at UBC and I have a little project for one of our professors here, and basically, so I'm using a number of different approaches, so I can appreciate how labor intensive this is. But I use Google Scholar, and Google Scholar is fine. But I also have I've developed a little search engine to search all the Copernicus titles at once. So I pop in, and I do this every Friday morning because Friday morning I'm kind of tired from everything else I've been doing, and this is a fairly mindless task. So, but I use Google Scholar, I use the Wiley full text, I use the Copernicus search engine, and because I'm part of a UBC library, we have something called Summon, and I also use that. So I'm kind of looking at a lot of different places because I'm still learning how all these things work. I mean, Wiley is really easy. And I actually get email notifications from Wiley, and I use that to track Zenodo citations, Pangea citations, etc. So I do it also for Fluxnet. But like I say, in terms of journal articles that cite Fluxnet, it's probably about 3 or 4 a week on a good week. But that's kind of this little project I've been doing for about a year now. And there's every once in a while you see something interesting that published outside of the core journals, like something in agriculture or in engineering, but often it's a very tight cluster of journals where people publish and cite Fluxnet data.
Right, and so I'm not saying that this all isn't doable. It's just what became clear to me is without Crossref being fully functional, the amount of work required to maintain this and manual effort to clean it up is still high enough that I'd like to avoid doing it while we wait for Crossref to come up. So I think, my recommendation is that we do something suboptimal while we wait and then move to dynamic data citations once there are citation tools that will already find these citations for us.
I mean, I'd be very willing to. I'm a librarian. I'm not a Fluxnet researcher, but I mean, if you want to, I throw this out to you and the powers that be, if you want me to add things to a website on Fluxnet, I'd gladly do that. I just need the sysadmin A-OK to do those kinds of things, and I gladly do it.
Yeah, can we get you to do it for AmeriFlux too?
Of course.
Absolutely. That's the best of all worlds, We can just party now.
It's not that onerous a task, actually. Well, I mean, onerous is a real. I'm kind of good at doing mindless things. I don't know why, but I'm not a programmer, so I have to do it the old school with a hammer and I crunch the rock, kind of like a Neanderthal. But maybe one day I'll learn how to program better. But I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, so maybe contact me offline and we can take this forward. So.
Well, and if you have enough of the mechanics, we have some programmers that could help maybe automate it.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love to meet. That's excellent. So.
Yeah, because because I've kept it to 1 per site, we only have 350 DOIs we have to look for.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I misspoke here.
That's the point.
Oh, oops. Okay. Maybe, all right. Okay. Yeah.
Rock and hammer are a little bit. I'm pretty sure after one Friday you would tell us, I am not that mindless.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah. I'm only looking at two sites, 18140 and the 17190. That's what makes it so easy. So yeah.
Well, we should still talk. I think we
Okay.
should definitely talk.
All right.
And I apologize to everyone for going over a little bit. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. Feel free to send us questions at the AmeriFlux-support mailing list at lbl.gov. That's a great way. We track those. We make sure they get answered and all those things. Love to hear feedback from you on what you think. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.